It's very hard to follow such a wonderfully sort of visionary talk. But if you think of me as boots on the ground, you'll understand what we're going to talk about today. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to sort of taking you through a whirlwind course of what we've developed at the Center for really practical application for planning and taking these trials to increase diversity. I was asked to talk about tools and resources that we've developed, and therefore I always do what I'm told, and which isn't true if anybody knows me. And I'm happy to do what I was asked to do. I have no conflicts of interest for this talk. Do thank you for inviting me. We are supported by grants as well as by contributions. So the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center is a research and policy center shared between the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard that really focuses on the conduct, oversight, ethics of international clinical trials. And we do that sort of as the meta of clinical trials, not actually running clinical trials themselves, but with the hope that we can improve the safety, efficacy, and rigor of clinical trials worldwide. We do that work by engaging stakeholders, whoever is involved in a question or an emerging issue, getting them around the table to really think through what are the practical solutions to make a difference. We started the work on diversity, inclusion, and equity seriously at MRCT probably 7 or 8 years ago now, and then created a work group around this at the time that the first FDA snapshots, which reports the representation of both gender, race, and ethnicity in the US annually. Latha and Eldrin were both part of that initial work group, and we've worked closely together. So my perspective is the following, and I'm sure you all agree that participant enrollment is often a challenge. We always talk about challenges in recruitment and retention, but it's particularly problematic when you look at underrepresented populations in research. But participation in clinical research should reflect the population affected by the disease or for whom that intervention is intended, not sort of restricted by who can afford that intervention. It should be for the population affected. And yet when we look at drug approvals, certainly, at the time of drug approvals, there's very small populations of patients, largely, cardiovascular medicine being a single exception. And it's very hard to get studies powered to really look at statistically significant differences between subpopulations. And if you challenge that, you'd need to make these studies hugely, huge in number to really be effective in that way. So this is more about seeing trends, something that we'll talk about in the statistical considerations later on today, but also there is a social need and a social value of bringing people into those trials in terms of trust. I also posit that, if you don't include them, you're leaving science on the table. You never know what you don't know if you haven't included them. And you can also design trials to pick up additional populations in an extension trial if you start to see differences. So it seeks to address both the sort of social value of trials to society, as well as to the individual themselves. And it's not simply a matter of biology, but also one of fairness and representation. I think that we have to be very thoughtful in terms of how we think about which trial you're looking at. Phase 1 is very, very different than phase 3. By the time a drug is approved, you should be looking at the population affected by the disease. You might not choose to do that for a phase 1 trial. You might choose to take people who are a little healthy or, sort of a different population. But by the time you're using those drugs in a marketed application, after market approval, it should absolutely represent the populations affected. So if you look at the drug trial snapshots, you'll see that over the last 6 years, when they've published this data, the FDA approved 339 drugs over 6 years. Of those, 21% included less than or 1% Asian participants. 25% included less than or 1% Black participants. The FDA, as much as I love them, also reported the median numbers that were in the groups. We reanalyzed their data and showed the average weighted by enrollment, and you'll see the numbers are much, much lower. We've got a real problem in the US, and while we're now working on global diversity and inclusion, I think that this sort of punches the problem we have in the US today. So the work we've done, it's all on a website, but basically we spent the first few years creating a document, addressing DE&I in very direct terms, starting with an 80-page, sort of exegesis of why this is important, because we always got pushback. I think we get less pushback now that, post-COVID and post-George Floyd murder, but, that was important. We also developed a toolkit, and behind each of these is a drop-down of various tools that you can use. We then developed, even though we had written this 400-page book to sort of help people said, well, now what do we do? So we developed a sort of series to introduce by webinar and slides each of the different sections. That then, they said, well, that's a lot to do. So we then took that apart and made a series of sort of leaning into certain issues and specific problems. We created a course in equity in clinical research, which is now online and available. We've worked on several aspects that I'm not going to talk about today, but one is sort of inclusion of people with intellectual and cognitive disability, and really pushing for supported decision-making as a tool for inclusion. We've done a lot of work in health literacy and clinical research that I'll mention, with tools around each of the things that you should be thinking about for health literacy. We then developed an equity by design metrics framework, which is dense and complicated. I'll speak to a little bit later. IRB and HRPP tools, and finally, accessibility by design for people with disabilities. We're currently working on a few other groups, such as LGBTQI+, because each of these folks that are underrepresented have a different set of issues that need to be addressed with appropriate humility. So taking you through some of these, what we found is that when people are asked to participate, they generally say yes, but people are not asked to participate. And if you look at the fact that this study was done in oncology, but are racial and ethnic minorities less willing to participate in health research? Yet no, they're exactly the same willingness to participate. They're just not asked. We did a small, non-statistically significant study to find out why, and asked a series of investigators about why they didn't include them. Well, they have children at home. What? They won't be able to make the appointments. It's far away to travel, et cetera. So we thought we really need to sort of set down some basics of how to go about that. So a lot of it relates to access to knowledge and choice. access and accessibility of the trial itself, referral and resources. Not everybody is going to be seen as a primary care patient in this setting. Some of that is outreach to the community, and I'm not going to spend much time on the community because others are. And they need to be designed for the patient, not for the investigator. But when you think about increasing the participant pool, even if it's more difficult initially, you will increase enrollment if you have a larger participant pool. And the promise yet to be achieved, or yet to be demonstrated, is that that will result in faster trials and trials that complete. The worst thing that happens is trials that don't complete because they never actually answer the question. So when we think about addressing inclusivity, we think about access and knowledge about the trial, eligibility issues, trial accessibility, trial burden and operations, trial costs and accommodations. We're going to talk about each of these, and then the end of study and communications. But we're thinking about not only race and ethnicity, sex, gender, and sexual orientation, the age, the young or pediatrics often excluded, the very old often excluded, pregnancy, lactation, disability or impairment, the social determinants of health that were just discussed, comorbidities, concomitant medications, and then a real deficit in patients from rural populations, and then the influence of genetics. And for each of these, let me go back to what was introduced earlier, which is the importance of intersectionality. People aren't just a woman or a man. They're not just black or white. There is an intersection of all of these dimensions of diversity that must be taken into account. So, when we think about a clinical trial, we think about balancing risk and benefit. When a patient thinks about a clinical trial, they sort of consider the benefit, but then they also consider the risk to them and their families and the burden of those trials. And that is exactly what we sort of pick through piece by piece by piece to try and see how many of these things were reversible and what could we do. So if you think about a planning, and I agree with Eldrin's comment earlier, you can't think about this at the end. You have to think about it at the beginning. You have to think about it throughout. There's inclusion throughout the participant journey, from early interventions before they get to enrollment and their patient and community engagement, as you've just discussed, education and health literacy, which we'll talk about, a feasibility assessment, and eligibility criteria. When you look at study conduct, that's a huge number of specific issues, but they need to be planned for and addressed. We'll talk about some of those. And at the end of the study, there's certainly the data standards so that there's interoperability of the data analysis, but then importantly, results reporting back to the patient, back to the community, and published, and then back to the community from which one came from so that they benefit from it. So there's every touch point will have impact, and that's not to say that other pieces aren't incredibly important here, like workforce development, infrastructure, cultural competencies, and resources. And those aren't easy because all of this are trade-offs. But if we don't do the right trade-offs, we're never going to get there. And I would posit that we should be doing less trials and better trials with the same resources that we have. I don't expect you to read this, but you're going to get the slides, and this is all available for you. We've tried to sort of section it so that you can think about the specifics. Honestly, if you take a picture from back there, it's not going to help. So, I'm happy to share the slides. And when you think about it, so the first is participant and community engagement, getting there early, getting there genuinely, staying there. It's very important to me that we don't send individual investigators to the community to pop in for their trial and pop out, that it's an investment from the organization and it's a continuous investment. The worst thing we can do is sort of instrumentalize our neighbors. And then input to the study questions and to the outcomes, and then talking about communications. If you're trying to reach certain populations, the way they get their trusted information is different population to population. Study design, I would say we have to address both traditional as well as hybrid and decentralized clinical trials. It's easier, but there are ethical and issues to consider, but also data minimization. It's interesting, when we started this work, the LGBTQ community really wanted to be known in the demographics. Now, post the sort of change in our politics, people are very cautious about what information is collected about them in an identified way. It's huge change over 5 years. And then mobile enabled, like e-consents, making everything that we can easier. Remote monitoring and geomapping, so we're placing the trials in places that can deliver the kinds of representative populations that we'd like. Thinking about designing the trial for inclusion, accessible, health literate, translation, we'll talk about each of these, eligibility, recruitment, having patient navigators in the community, and then payment so people aren't out of pocket and at the end of the trial. They should be resourced with digital and data access, with technologies, with help for those technologies, financial neutrality so that there isn't the cost to them at the end, and insurance independence. I think people are particularly worried about confidentiality in communications, and we have to figure out how to impart a trustworthy effort there. And then as making sure that we have the connectivity and end of study I've mentioned. So the toolkit is there. Each of these are sort of brought down with a series of tools and resources below each one. They are downloadable, editable, and adaptable just to start you off. Fine to use them and then make it your own. If you do make a cogent suggestion that will improve it, please let us know, because we'd like to make that available to the community. So the feasibility assessment is really important. You know, you plan a trial and then you think about it and you try to think about how we're going to get this trial to deliver the patients of the intended populations that we consider. And we have, for each population, these are different considerations. How was the input of the patient and community solicited, incorporated, and how were they responded to? Will community partners be engaged in that outreach? Is eligibility as broad as possible? Is every research data visit and procedure necessary? Are there less burdensome ways of getting that data? And if the on-site visit is necessary, are they optimized for the patient population? In other words, do you only have clinics Monday to Friday from 9 to 4, where people would have to miss work? Or could you stay open one night or Saturday mornings or whatever? And then think about it at the end of the trial and go back again and see how much more you could change. The eligibility criteria. Study design influences eligibility criteria. Adaptive trials allow the progressive inclusion of populations over time. As more data is known, you can expand that population. But the exclusion criteria should be objective and scientifically sound. We've heard a lot of cut and paste from one trial to another trial in the same study question. And I think the justification should be explicit for excluding people and then be reviewed by oversight committees. And the eligibility criteria should be as broad as possible and as narrow as necessary. But when there is prior evidence of heterogeneity of treatment effect, the eligibility criteria should be broad so we can see that sort of variability reflected in the results. Again, think about the differences across the time. And there are some excellent resources out there for thinking about this. ASCO is doing it, NIDDK is now starting to think about that, and then there's resources throughout. We have developed a recruitment strategy document which goes through a number of different sort of thoughts about how to recruit and what you need to recruit. It contains strategies, suggestions, and the creation of contingency plans if you're failing to recruit as you intended. I will say that the diversity plans that came out from the FDA recently are very helpful, and we're now developing a diversity action plan template for people to consider. At least having some way to start this work is easier than trying to read the guidance and then sort of sit down and create it yourself. So moving to patient centricity, we were very site-based. We're now very participant-based, thinking about how much can be done in the community. Do people need to come in? Can we use local labs and pharmacies? Can we have imaging locally? We've done this forever, but we haven't been thinking about it as a strategic implementation for inclusion. And then there are lots of other questions about how much electronic patient-reported outcomes can be used, how we used measures that people can sort of craft into their everyday life. But the issue of decentralized clinical trials raises huge questions of privacy and confidentiality. During COVID, we worked with, and continue to, with a community center group in Massachusetts, and there are people who could not find a private place in their house to have a conversation. So, you know, and did not want us to see the background with how they were living. And so we had to develop a whole sort of structure of informing people how to blur their, you know, background and what you should do for privacy issues. I'm also very afraid, just to say, that as we move towards digitally enabled trials, we'll begin to see a different excluded population, those who do not have the digital access, who cannot afford the digital access, or who are not comfortable with digital applications and technologies like the elderly. So what else can we do? Well, the first thing we can do is learn how to talk to each other and to patients. Health literacy has often been seen as a problem of poor literacy, a problem on the part of the listener. They have low literacy levels. I would suggest that the communicator is responsible for making information understood in a way that the recipient of that information understands, and their responsibility is to be comfortable saying if they don't understand. And it's a problem for people whose you know, language, first preferred language, is not English in this country. We have therefore done a lot of work on health literacy and principles, and sort of taken you know, each of the sections of health literacy, not just plain language, but numeracy, imaging, visualization, cultural considerations, interaction, all of the rest of them, and tried to dissect them into workable pieces, so when there's a question, you can use it. We've developed a clinical research glossary in plain language that has, you know, definitions that have been defined by a group of patients and participants, as well as by investigators. Imaging to try to help people that learn better by seeing or not. And it is now going to be a CETA standard and incorporated into the dictionaries. But it's not just the informed consent. There's education throughout and communication throughout the clinical trial, including sort of learning about the clinical trial, data collection, individual results return, and summary results return. And it's not just, as I mentioned, plain language, it's also numeracy, visualization, clear design, cultural considerations. It's written material and verbal, oral communication, and it should be in a language understandable to the participant. This is the conversion, for instance, of a patient instruction for how to give themselves medication that was taken. We worked with them, but looked at the original and then the one on the right, which was health literate, using imaging to help define it. None of us, as health literate as we are, would prefer the left to the right. So, I think there's good reason to believe that if we really work this through, that it's going to be much easier for everyone. And we have a training resources for IRBs so that they can read their patient-facing materials or participant-facing materials in a way that makes it accessible to them. The common rule and FDA both require information that is given to the subject or the representative in a language understandable to the subject or the representative. But here you balance, do we translate all of these materials, written materials, into all of the languages? And what's the cost, time, delay, et cetera? Versus, the counterbalancing need for justice, understanding, and autonomy. And that's a balance. But I would say that, in certain communities, they should be at least translated into the languages of those communities early in the, if not at the study start, because when we delay translating into Spanish, for instance, we delay entry of those patients and participants into the trial. We did a study to look at the language requirements in a study, and if you look across clinicaltrials.gov, for adults with one site in the US, registered over a 2-year period, 19% required the ability to read, write, or speak English, or be a native English speaker. And only a few of them were justified. The justification was often the tool that we're using to collect data has only been validated in English. I think that's the kind of thing we can change. And it's discriminatory, and in this, climate, and particularly because we now have a proposed rule, this is going to be something we should attend to. Payment is really important. People should not be exploited, should not be worse off at the end of the trial than they were at the beginning. And, I don't see this as a question of coercion ever, unless you promise something and then say, if you don't complete the trial, we're taking it away. It may be undue influence. I would say most of the time it's mere influence. So we have really tried to lay out what the issues are and now work with the federal government to remove some of the barriers. If people are paid, not reimbursed, they need to retain receipts for reimbursement, but paid and compensated for time and burden. It is income. It becomes reportable. And at $2,000, they can lose their eligibility for SNAP and other things. This is like, well, don't ask me. The politics of this just make me crazy. And we have developed a sort of work list, a decision tree. We've now gone on to look at accessibility for people with disabilities, thinking about general considerations, communication difficulties, physical accessibility, and then newer strategies, and accessibility and advocacy for people with disability. We did not talk at that time about decisional issues and capacity, because that would become a different issue in terms of what we needed to consider in terms of LAR. But as I mentioned, we're working on supported decision-making and have used that. So I think that all of us are accountable. Each group has their own sort of contribution that they can make, and that it's important to do that. How do we hold ourselves accountable? A lot of people say, well, if everybody's accountable, nobody's accountable. I think we are all accountable, and we all have to help each other remain accountable until this is changed. But how do we know what we're doing? So we have an equity by design metrics framework, which takes us through each of those components, has both qualitative and quantitative themes, and then levels of details that can be accessed. And we're now working with city national academies and faster cures to sort of lay this out in a way that is easier to digest and use. I don't want to not mention the workforce. I know that we're going to be talking about that differently, but I think we need to think about, as we heard earlier, the diversity of the workforce itself, and invest in talent and talent development and in training. And we should be looking at this as a sort of empirical question. What works? Do summer programs work? Does grants for underrepresented minority populations that are underrepresented work? And how do we support what may be, different needs of the workforce? So what do? We start with knowing the intended population. I always come back to that. I think you should create a diversity action plan. I think it's unfortunate that the FDA requires it, the NIH does not, and other entities, funders do not. If it's a rare disease, I would say that in early phase trial particularly, it's first come, first served. You don't want to wait for a patient to show up who's of a certain population, particularly since it won't be statistically significant, but you need to make absolutely sure that there's access to everyone and that it's a multi-site trial and that you're open to collaboration and that you've planned for inclusivity. I think you quantify the enrolled population and add an extension trial for populations that were not enrolled during the trial itself. So if you enroll white population, then keep it open for Black, Hispanic, and others, so you can, continue to get that data and understand it. But if it's a common or commoner condition, then there should be intentional recruitment, starting with feasibility and site selection and making sure that you are sited in a place that will deliver the intended population and you've resourced the trial appropriately. Engage with the community, the healthcare providers, sites and study teams, and then learn from your experience. I think that getting continuous assessment is essential, that we often wait till the end of the trial and then look at what we succeeded at doing or not. And yet, every year in the RPPR or to the IRB, there is a report of the recruitment and retention, but nobody looks at it, and no feedback is almost ever given. So we've got the data, we're just not attending to it. But I think that needs to be quantified and specific, and then figure out what you can do during the trial to correct these imbalances if they exist, and to find out if the study has fulfilled its accrual goals. So with that, I think we are accountable for making progress. I look forward to the discussion. And as a friend of mine said, we have to stop talking and start doing. So thank you very much.